What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Echoes of Elsewhere, the podcast about abandoned places, forgotten histories, urban exploration, and the stories left behind when the rest of the world moves on. I'm your host, Courtney Autumn. Before we jump into today's episode, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm slowly shifting gears for this podcast by incorporating something new. If you've been listening to Echoes of Elsewhere for a while, you know that the show has always focused primarily on abandoned places. We explore the history behind them, the people connected to them, and the strange experiences that come with stepping into locations that have been left behind. But from the very beginning, I've occasionally mentioned an idea I have been wanting to experiment with. And that idea is called Beyond the Abandoned. In case you missed the first segment of Beyond the Abandoned, be sure to go back and listen to my interview with Rose Urbex, where we discuss the parallels between our lives, abandoned places, and the spirits that linger between the two. The concept of Beyond the Abandoned is pretty simple. Sometimes abandoned places are more than just abandoned places. They can become the backdrop for mysteries or the setting for tragedy. Sometimes they become the final resting place of stories that haven't fully been told. And every now and then they become connected to something far larger than urban exploration itself. So today, we are stepping slightly outside our usual lane while still staying firmly rooted in the world we all know and love. This isn't a ghost story. This isn't a historical deep dive, and this isn't an exploration recap. Today, we're venturing into the darker side of abandoned places, the side that exists beyond the architecture and beyond the thrill of discovery. We are talking about the moments when abandoned places intersect with real-life crime and real-life tragedy. I do want to preface that today's episode discusses death, homicide, and disturbing subject matter, so listener discretion is advised. With that said, let's begin. Every explorer has heard the stories, the haunted house, the abandoned asylum. Maybe it's a building locals avoid after dark. Maybe it's a location with decades of rumors attached to it. Every town seems to have one. You've probably heard dozens of these stories. I know I have. What people often interpret as haunting is something much more human. Loss, memory, the passing of time, the lingering presence of lives that once occupied a space. And that's part of what draws so many of us to abandoned places. We're not necessarily looking for ghosts, we're looking for stories. We're looking for traces of people, evidence that life happened there. And most times, that kind of evidence is bittersweet, but beautiful. And other times, like in this case, it can be terrifying and heartbreaking. Because abandoned places don't just preserve memories. They preserve secrets. The longer a building sits forgotten, the more likely it becomes a place where things can happen unseen. Things can be hidden. Evidence can disappear. People can come and go without anyone noticing. Most explorers never encounter anything more dangerous than signs of squatters, evidence of illegal activity, maybe a clue to a story nobody knew existed. The reality is that abandoned places occupy a strange space in our world. They're physically present, but socially invisible. Thousands of people drive past them every day without really giving them a second thought. And because of that, they sometimes become repositories for things people don't want found. That's why today's story hits differently for those of us in the urban exploration community, because it begins exactly the way countless explorations begin. A supposedly haunted house, a group of curious people looking for a little adventure, and then a discovery so shocking that it transformed an ordinary afternoon into a murder investigation. A reminder that sometimes the most frightening stories connected to abandoned places have nothing to do with ghosts at all. Sometimes the real horror is entirely human. This is the story of Robert Fuller. Part 1, The House on Woodview Circle. Orangeburg County sits in the central portion of South Carolina. I'm no stranger to the area. I've spent a lot of time driving the back roads of Orangeburg, and like much of the rural South, it contains countless forgotten properties scattered throughout the countryside. Old homes slowly being reclaimed by nature, buildings that once housed families, businesses, and communities. And among those forgotten properties was a house located on Woodview Circle near the town of Norway. According to reports, the house had been abandoned for roughly a decade, and the property had become one of those places that naturally attracts rumors. Locals reportedly described it as haunted. Whether anyone truly believed those stories is impossible to know, but curiosity has a way of drawing people toward abandoned places, especially when there's a mystery attached. In January of 2021, a group of 8 people riding ATVs decided to visit the property. It was supposed to be nothing more than an interesting stop during their ride, a chance to see the infamous haunted house for themselves, and what they found instead would make headlines across South Carolina.
In the Orangeburg County town of Norway now, Orangeburg deputies say the discovery was made after several people visited an abandoned home because they heard that this house you see here was haunted.
Part 2, The Discovery. Imagine walking through an abandoned property. If you're an explorer, you've done it dozens of times before, maybe hundreds. You're scanning rooms, looking at what's been left behind, trying to piece together the story of the place. Nothing seems unusual, and then someone notices a deep freezer sitting on the back porch. Not exactly uncommon. Abandoned houses often contain appliances, furniture, personal belongings, entire snapshots of everyday life. I've seen dozens of abandoned refrigerators and freezers in my time exploring, but I've never been tempted to open any of them. But when the freezer at the abandoned house on Woodview Circle was opened, everything changed. Inside was a human body. Not a mannequin, not an animal, a human body. The remains were badly decomposed, the smell was overwhelming, and within moments, what had begun as an afternoon adventure became a crime scene. Authorities were contacted, investigators arrived, the coroner became involved, and suddenly the question was no longer whether the house was haunted. The question was, who was in the freezer? Part 3, Identifying the Remains. At first, investigators couldn't even determine basic information about the victim. The body had decomposed to such a degree that identifying the person would take time, and for days the victim remained unknown. Imagine the family, and imagine not knowing where your loved one is, not knowing whether they're alive, not knowing that investigators are standing in an abandoned house trying to determine whether a body in a freezer belongs to them. Eventually, authorities identified the victim as 24-year-old Robert Fuller of Branchville, South Carolina. At that point, the case shifted. It was no longer a mystery about who was in the freezer. Now the question became, how did Robert Fuller end up there, and who put him there? Investigators eventually classified the death as a murder, but answers would prove difficult to find. Part 4, The Fire.
We've got more now on our top story. An update from the story we brought you yesterday of an abandoned home where a body was found. Well, that home is now a pile of ashes.
As strange as the story already sounds, this is where it becomes even more bizarre. Just days after the discovery of the body, the abandoned house burned to the ground. Fire officials described the blaze as suspicious, obviously. The structure was essentially destroyed, completely gone. Let's think about that for a second. A body is discovered in a freezer. The location becomes the center of a murder investigation, and the building catches fire only days later. It's a little weird. Anyways, investigators never publicly released evidence proving the fire was connected to the homicide, but obviously it's impossible not to wonder. Was someone trying to destroy evidence? Was someone panicking because the body had been discovered? Was it a coincidence? I'm not really one to believe in coincidences, so I don't know. And it could have been something else entirely, but to this day, that's one of the details that people remember most about this case, is not just the body, but the fire and the timing and the feeling that somebody might have been watching events unfold and then reacting to them. Part 5, the investigation. Months passed. Investigators continued working the case. Then, in June of 2021, the Orangeburg County Sheriff's Office announced they were looking for a person of interest. The name they gave was Kendall Dixon. Authorities stated they believed he might have information regarding Robert Fuller's murder. Public statements stopped short of accusing him of committing the crime, but investigators wanted to speak with him. So, to be clear, he was not a suspect, but more so a person of interest that may know something about the incident that took place. And as of an article published 7 months ago, Kendall Dixon never came forward with any information. And that's where much of the public trail goes cold. No dramatic courtroom conclusion, no major press conference, no nationally televised arrest. Just a lingering mystery. A victim, a freezer, a burned house, and a lot of unanswered questions. Part 6. Why this story matters, especially if you explore. This case hits differently. If you're part of the urban exploration community, most people hear the story and focus on the murder. Explorers hear the story and think about how easily it could have been them making this discovery. Every explorer has walked into a place expecting one thing and finding something completely different. And most of the time, it's harmless. But sometimes, abandoned places become places where people hide things, and sometimes they become places where crimes happen. And occasionally, they become places where the truth waits quietly for someone curious enough to open the wrong door. The reality is that abandoned spaces exist outside normal observation. There are few visitors, few witnesses, few questions, and for that reason, they sometimes attract the very people who don't want to be seen. Part 7. The questions that remain. Even today, there are still questions that continue to linger. How long was Robert Fuller there? Was the house chosen because it was abandoned, or was there some connection between the victim and the property? Who set the fire? Was it related? And perhaps one of the biggest questions of all, would Robert Fuller have been found if a group of curious writers hadn't decided to investigate a supposedly haunted house that afternoon? It's a reminder that sometimes mysteries are solved not by detectives, not by forensic scientists, not by technology, but by ordinary people who happen to be in the right place at exactly the right time. When people ask why urban explorers are drawn to abandoned places, they often assume it's about architecture or history or photography, and sometimes it is. But abandoned places can also be a collection of human stories, and most are mundane, some are beautiful, and a few are deeply unsettling. The house on Woodview Circle no longer stands. The fire made sure of that. But the mystery remains: an abandoned house that was once haunted, a freezer hiding a murder victim, a structure that burned before it could tell all of its secrets, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a young man named Robert Fuller whose story still deserves answers. For me personally, one of the most puzzling aspects of this entire case isn't even what happened inside of that abandoned house. It's what I couldn't find afterward. While researching for this episode, I came across numerous comments from Orangeburg locals expressing their own frustrations and confusion surrounding the case. Many seem to be asking the same questions I found myself asking. Who exactly was Robert Fuller? Beyond his name and age, there appears to be very little public information available about his life. No photographs that were widely circulated, very little discussion about his background, very little insight into who he was as a person before becoming the victim at the center of the story. And maybe what stood out to me the most was how difficult it was to find any indication that he had been reported missing. And I know that doesn't necessarily mean he wasn't. Not every missing person case receives media attention, and not every investigative detail becomes public record. But considering the condition investigators reportedly found him in, it's reasonable to assume he had been deceased for quite some time before his remains were discovered. Long enough that someone somewhere should have noticed his absence. At least that's what many of us would hope. Did he have family, friends, co-workers, neighbors? Was there someone waiting for a phone call that never came, a birthday that he never showed up for, a shift at work he missed, a conversation that simply stopped one day? Those are the questions I kept coming back to while researching this case. Not because they're sensational, but because they're human. And they're the questions that help us remember there was a person at the center of all of this. As for the investigation itself, there are questions that still linger publicly. Authorities identified a person of interest years ago, yet many members of the community still feel as though there are more questions than there are answers. Perhaps investigators know far more than they've been able to release, and perhaps there are details being withheld to protect the integrity of the case. And if that's true, that's completely understandable. Investigations often require patience from the public, but when years pass without significant updates, uncertainty naturally fills the gaps. People begin wondering whether the case remains active, whether new leads are still being pursued, whether answers are still possible, and perhaps most importantly, whether Robert Fuller's family will ever receive the closure they deserve. The truth is, none of us on the outside know everything investigators know. There may be reasons for the silence, but from the perspective of many local residents and from the perspective of someone researching this case years later, the story feels unfinished. And as time passes, there's always the risk that fewer people ask questions, fewer people remember, and fewer people continue searching for answers. And that's why stories like this matter, because sometimes simply continuing to ask what happened is the thing that keeps a story alive. Before I wrap up, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something that's easy to lose sight of when discussing cases like this, that Robert Fuller was a real person, not just a victim found inside a freezer at an abandoned house. He was someone's son, someone's family member, someone's friend, someone who had a life, memories, plans, and people who cared about them. As explorers, we're often drawn to the stories attached to abandoned places, and we always want to understand what happened there. We want answers, and we want to uncover the history that's been left behind. But stories like this remind us that sometimes those histories are still deeply personal to the people living with them. Somewhere, there are family members who have spent years carrying the weight of this loss and searching for answers that may still feel incomplete. So while today's episode explored the mystery surrounding the house on Woodview Circle, I'd like to end by remembering the person at the center of it all. Robert Fuller. Not as a headline, not as a case file, but as a human being whose life mattered. If by chance anyone listening has information related to this case or information that could help investigators better understand what happened, you can contact the Orangeburg County Sheriff's Office at 803-531-4647 or submit an anonymous tip through Crime Stoppers at 1-888-CRIME-SC. If there's anything I hope this installment of Beyond the Abandoned accomplishes, it's reminding us that abandoned places are often more than forgotten structures. Sometimes they become the last remaining witnesses to stories that still deserve answers. And while we may never know every detail of what happened, speaking a person's name, sharing their story, and remembering that they mattered ensures that they're not simply lost to time. Stories have a way of preserving what would otherwise be forgotten. And if this podcast can play even a small role in keeping those stories alive, then I'm honored to be one of those voices. Thank you for coming back to listen to another episode of Echoes of Elsewhere. If you want to read more about this case, I've left some links in the description, so feel free to check those out. And if you want to support the show, making sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode and leaving a review is the best way to help the podcast keep growing, and I'd be forever grateful if you took a few seconds to do so. If there's a mystery, crime, or haunting attached to an abandoned place that you'd like to hear covered on a future segment of Beyond the Abandoned, feel free to send those suggestions my way. All the ways to find me and reach out to me are also in the episode description. Thank you again for listening. I will be back in a few weeks. Until then, keep exploring the allure in the abandoned, the beauty of decay, and the echoes of elsewhere.